This video is sponsored by Vox Link, a new social media app that helps you find players in your local area to get games of Warhammer 40k. More about them later on in the video. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and this is the first video in what's going to be a three-part series of how to play Warhammer 40k. Warhammer 40k 10th edition is in full swing and is the best that it's released so far. So whether you're a new player just jumping into the game or a veteran player trying to get a brush up on the rules, this video series is for you. In this video, we're going to be covering the core rules of Warhammer 40,000. By the end of the video, you're going to have a good idea how to operate with your army on the table and progress through all of the stages of a battle round, alongside all of the core mechanics like movement and combat contained within. And by the end of this series, you're going to be able to play a full game of Warhammer 40,000 from start to finish, including everything from advanced rules, stratagems, secondary objectives, and finally victory conditions. I'm also going to be doing a lot of this breakdown on Tabletop Simulator. Tabletop Simulator does exactly what it says on the tin. It simulates a tabletop, and you can play Warhammer 40k on it. It plays exactly like the in-person tabletop games. I'm just going to be using it as a demonstration tool for the mechanics that we're talking about. I also have a new player playlist that I'll link down in the video description that will have some videos on how to install and play Tabletop Simulator if you want to as well. And with that, let's dive into the rules of Warhammer 40,000 10th edition. So here we are in Tabletop Simulator. Well, we're talking about some core concepts for the game before diving into a breakdown of the phases, turns, and exactly how the game progresses. First of all of the figures on the table are collectively referred to as models. Now, models are organized together into entities called units. Now, a unit might be a single character, a single large vehicle, or even a group of models, most commonly infantry. Regardless of the number of models that compose a unit, they all act together at the same time during each phase, and they all maneuver around the battlefield together. Now, characters will often have the ability to join into units. They don't do this automatically. This is something that's decided before the game starts, after you see your opponent's list. We'll talk about that more when we talk about some of the more advanced rules, and I have a video specifically about how characters operate normally. But in this case, we're just going to be considering all of these units as separate. So these tactical marines are gathered together into one unit of 5 models. This land raider is a single entity unit, as well as the character over here too. Now, in Warhammer 40,000, the relationship between all models is determined by distance. So you'll see that many units have a movement characteristic, have ranges on their ranged weapons, or even aura effect that apply to an area around them. And all of these are determined in inches, which is just a true measurement. This is called a true measurement game. It is a true measurement of distance between those two game elements on the table. Now, were we to be playing on a physical table, we would be measuring this distance with a tape measure. When you are measuring the distance between two models and determining how far apart they are, you always measure the distance between the two closest points of those models. Now, this is agnostic of line of sight, so once we start talking about targeting for ranged attacks, the line that you're drawing line of sight across is not the same one as the one that you're drawing range from. Range is always the two closest points of the bases, or in the case of vehicles, any part of the vehicle model. That's called measuring to the hull of the vehicle, which includes outstretched things like weapons and antenna, which is a little bit weird, but that is how the rule works. Now, while models need to be within a certain distance of each other in order to attack or be attacked, units sometimes will measure their range independently. When you're measuring range for a unit, so this is, for example, an ability that specifies you have to target a unit that's in range, or an aura that affects all units within a certain distance, you measure simply between the closest points of the bases of the two nearest models to each other. However, when a unit is attacking, each model will target their weapons separately, and those can only target enemies that are in range of that model specifically. So in that case, you would measure from model to model in the unit. Now, units that are composed of multiple models must maintain something called coherency. Like I mentioned before, all of these models in the unit are going to operate together as a single entity. And while moving each model, they all move independently, they do have to remain within coherency, which is a distance from other models in the unit. In order to remain in coherency, a unit must have all of its members within 2 inches of each other in a contiguous chain. So in this case, as we can see, each one of these Space Marines is 2 inches from each other, so this unit remains within coherency. If you have a larger unit of 7 or more models, so if we added 2 Space Marines here, the coherency requirements get a little bit more restrictive, and each model in the unit must have 2 allies within 2 inches of each other rather than just 1. Obviously, this is easier for the models in the center of the line because they're going to have models on each side of them, but it does mean that larger units have to remain a little bit more clumped up than the smaller units that can string out in a single line. Now, casualties and models being destroyed can sometimes break coherency throughout the game, and there are penalties that are associated with that at the end of the turn, which we'll talk about when we get there. But anytime a unit is set up on the battlefield or moves, they must maintain their coherency. Any move that would take them out of coherency is illegal. The unit snaps back to its original position and you have to redo the move in such a way that they remain within coherency. If that can't be done, then they can't move that way. Now, the result of attacks and many other interactions in Warhammer 40,000 are determined by dice rolls. The game essentially exclusively uses d6s. That means a 6-sided dice, which is sort of your classic cube-shaped die. But oftentimes, you'll see that the rules require you to roll either dice with a smaller number of facings, specifically d3. The result of this can be determined easily by taking the result of a 1d6 roll and halving it. So, for example, were I to roll a 1, halving it and rounding up would get me the result of a 1. However, if I rolled, let's say, a 6, then having that would get the result of a 3. So that's how you roll out a d3 if the rules call upon you to do so. And many times the rules will ask you to roll multiple sets of d6, for example, 2d6 or 3d6, in which case the number before the d is the number of dice, and then the 6 representing the 6-sided die. This video has been sponsored by Vox Link, a new social media app designed by gamers for gamers. Whether or not you're brand new to Warhammer 40,000, getting back into the game, or just moving to a new location, finding a community that meshes with your playstyle, plays the type of games that you want, and values the same things on the tabletop that you do is of paramount importance for everyone to enjoy the game. It offers a place to find and meet new members of the community and find players and events in your local area to meet up for games. Vox Link is available totally free for users on Android and iOS, and you can find links to download it in the video description and the card on the screen right now. Currently, it offers a live feed and social media features so you can post about your games, upcoming events, or even just models that you've painted. It also showcases content from a variety of different content creators in the tabletop gaming sphere, including yours truly. We embarked on a quest to become the #1 liked channel on Vox Link, and I'm happy to say that we succeeded. So big thanks to everybody who joined the app and hit that heart button next to Tactical Tortoise. If you haven't done that yet, please go do so, and just check out Vox Link for all the cool features that it has. So I'll see you there. Now, in order to start a game of Warhammer 40,000, both players will bring an army of equal value, and I have a separate video talking about army construction that I'll put up in the card here. Once you have your armies determined, you and your opponent both roll for what's called attacker and defender. This is a 1d6 roll, and the player with the highest result wins. So in this case, the Ultramarines player would have won. The winner of the roll-off will then choose which player acts as the attacker and which player acts as the defender. The defender automatically deploys the first unit during the deployment step, and this can have benefits and drawbacks. The attacker will get to see where the defender's first unit is placed when deploying their own units, but there are some units that want to be placed on the table first in order to prevent other units from setting up around them. We'll talk about missions and mission compositions later, but your mission will dictate deployment zones for both players. These are the areas in which each player will set up with their army wholly within that area. So we have this 18 inches of the board for the red player, and for the blue player, the opposite side. From here, starting with the defender, each player will take turns placing units from their army wholly within their deployment zone, that area of the table that's been demarcated. Once both armies are fully set up, the players will roll again to determine who takes the first turn. The winner of this roll-off is required to take the first turn. They don't have a choice in the matter. That player will then begin their first turn, starting with their command phase. Now, turns in Warhammer 40,000 are broken down into 5 phases. Each player will get 1 turn, starting with the player going first, moving on to the second player, and then once the second player has completed their turn, the battle round will end, and it will reset, and the first player will take another turn. The phases each turn are broken down into is the command phase, which acts as sort of an upkeep phase for both armies. It's when points are scored and some abilities are triggered. The movement phase, in which all units from that player's army will move. The shooting phase, in which they will shoot. The charge phase, in which they will move towards your opponent to get into melee combat. And then the fight phase, where melee combat is resolved. There are then some effects that occur at the end of the turn, which is after the fight phase has concluded. Then it moves on to the other player, and they will follow the same sequence. Now, phases will typically be further broken down into steps and what are called activations. Steps are simply distinct portions of a phase in which certain effects trigger. Now, each player's turn starts with a command phase, which is kind of an upkeep phase for each player, which is broken down into the command step, which is when most of your command phase abilities proc, and the battle shock step, when the battle shock mechanic comes into play. We'll cover what happens during these command phase steps in a future video when we talk about advanced rules like battle shock and command points. Activations is more of a colloquialism. It's not actually a game term, but you'll hear a lot of players use it. In phases like movement, shooting, charge, and fight, units will operate one at a time, with the controlling player choosing the order in which they will act. They will then complete all of their actions for that phase and then move on to another unit. That simply refers to each time a unit is selected to do something within a phase. Once you have completed your command phase, which is all of your command phase abilities, battle shock checks for units that have suffered a lot of casualties, and scoring, you'll then move on to the movement phase. Now, the movement phase is governed by unit activations. In your movement phase, you will go down all of your units that are on the battlefield and select a type of movement for them to perform. There are 4 types of movements in Warhammer 40k that can be performed in the movement phase. These include normal moves, in which a unit moves up to its movement value in inches. That one's pretty simple. Advances, in which case you will roll a d6 for that unit and add that result to their movement characteristic. However, advancing typically will prevent you from doing other actions later on in that same turn. So you can't then shoot your weapons or charge unless you have some special abilities or special types of weapons that we'll talk about when we get to that section. So in this case, the Space Marine Captain here, he does have a movement 12 because he has a jump pack. He's going to add 4 to his movement, so he could, if he wanted to, move up to 16 inches thanks to that additional movement from advancing. Remaining stationary is another simple one. You simply don't move any of your models in your unit. However, there are some abilities that give you bonuses if you do remain stationary. Now, the last type of movement is called a fallback move. When a unit is engaged in close combat, meaning that they were charged by an enemy unit, charged an enemy unit, or during combat phase movements, which we'll talk about in the fight phase, they were then engaged by an enemy, they can only either fall back or remain stationary. So falling back is a special type of movement that can be performed when in engagement range, whereas normally other types of movement, such as normal moves and advances, can't be used once engaged by an enemy. In Warhammer 40,000, the engagement range of a model is 1 inch. Typically, models cannot move within that engagement range of enemy models during their movement phase. There are some exceptions to this, but the way to get into engagement range is the aforementioned charge moves or moves during the fight phase. That's how units become entangled in close combat. Now, fallback moves are a little bit special. You can perform them when you're engaged by an enemy, and you can even move through enemy models, which is normally a big no-no. You can also move through enemy engagement ranges, but you cannot end the move inside engagement of enemies. So this is a move that you're going to use to extricate your units that you don't want to be engaged in melee from being locked in melee combat. It's important to note that fallback moves can't be used if you aren't engaged with the enemy during your movement phase activation. Now, there is an interesting, unique ability with fallback moves, which allows you to move through enemy models, as I discussed. However, it forces what is called a desperate escape check. So in this case, if we wanted these termagants, for example, to, instead of moving away from the Tactical Marines, move towards them to get closer to enemies or take objectives, we could move them through the Tactical Marines. Now, the downside for fallback moves is if you are moving through enemy models, you must then roll a d6 for each model in your unit that moved through the enemy. So in this case, if all 10 termagants here moved through Tactical Marines, we would be rolling 10 dice on our desperate escape checks. Now for each 1 or 2 in our subsequent roll, and it looks like we have rolled 5 1s or 2s, one model in that unit of the controlling player's choice is destroyed. It doesn't have to be the models that moved through enemy models. It can be any model in the unit. So if you have particularly valuable models, they aren't necessarily destroyed thanks to desperate escape checks, but it does impose a pretty significant penalty on you if you elect to move through enemies. Now, each time a unit in Warhammer 40,000 moves, it's slid across the table a distance in inches. If it wants to break that movement up into multiple segments to round corners or move through other models, it is allowed to do so, just adding up the total distance that it moves. Now, as we discussed earlier, each of your units that's composed of multiple models must end these moves in coherency. The coherency is checked after all of the models in the unit have moved, so they don't need to remain within 2 inches during their move. They just all must be in that contiguous line after all of the models have performed their moves. Now, the facing of individual models doesn't normally matter in Warhammer 40,000, but it can affect your line of sight, since line of sight is drawn from any part of a model. So models with particularly large or protruding weapons like this las cannon marine may want to rotate around. Now, rotation does cost you a little bit of additional movement, because each time that model is slid across the table in a move, its actual distance traveled is the distance moved by the part of the base that moved the farthest. So for example, if we were to rotate this marine all the way around, the front of its base would have moved farther than the 2 inches that it looked like we moved the model. This is especially apparent for large units like land raiders or vehicles, where rotating can really dramatically change their position on the table, and that does cost movement. The easiest way to measure this is by simply measuring the sort of rotational distance from the front or back of the vehicle. So for example, if we wanted to rotate it so that its front bumper was here, we would have to do that and pay about 3 additional inches of movement before continuing to move the model. It's also important to note that for all of these moves, and in fact any kind of move that we're talking about during this video, you are allowed to move through other friendly units in your army, with one restriction, that monsters and vehicles cannot move through other monsters and vehicles unless they can fly. You're also not normally allowed to move through enemies outside of the fallback moves that we talked about previously, and if you fly, you can move over them as long as you don't end the movement inside their engagement range. Now, once all of the units in a player's army have moved, the shooting phase begins. This is when units shoot at each other. It's pretty self-explanatory. Units can shoot with their ranged weapons, assuming that they have a target within the range of their ranged weapon and line of sight, and we'll talk about how those are measured momentarily, and they did not advance that previous turn. Now, there are some special weapon keywords. There's a whole bunch of them in the game, but the most important one for right now is the assault weapon ability. This allows a unit to fire after it advances. However, only weapons with the assault ability can shoot in that circumstance. Now, visibility is one of the most important parts of 40k, and especially the shooting phase. Visibility is determined via what's called true line of sight. This is any line drawn between the attacking model and the defending model. It doesn't matter where that line is drawn from or to, so for example, if we really wanted to, we could have our las cannon marine over here be drawing his line of sight from the end of his extended gun. You could see any part of the termagant over here in order to give him clean line of sight. Now, some terrain can affect visibility. I do have an entire video on terrain and all the different types of terrain and exactly how that works, but the most important one that we're going to be talking about is called a ruin. All of these terrain features on the table here are ruins, and ruins will automatically block line of sight that's traced over them throughout their entire footprint unless either the defender is touching the base of the ruin. So for example here, the termagant would be inside the ruin, and then the visibility line from any part of the attacking model could be traced over that footprint to the defending model because they're inside the ruin. They can also be ignored by attacking models that are wholly within the area of that ruin. So this tactical squad is entirely on top of this ruin footprint, which means they're going to be allowed to ignore that ruin's footprint when determining line of sight. Now, beyond ruin footprints, other things can block line of sight. If that line traced between the attacker and defender model is impeded by physical objects, that will also prevent line of sight. So for example, these termagants hiding behind this wall here, the wall is a physical impediment, so we can see clearly that the line of sight cannot be traced to the termagants that are hiding behind the wall. There's a big wall there, which means that line of sight can't be drawn even though the termagants are inside this ruin. So it's important to remember that A, ruins will block line of sight to units hiding behind them, but even if you are inside the ruin, the line of sight still needs to be traced. So big walls and solid opaque objects will prevent line of sight from being established. Models can also sometimes prevent line of sight from being established. Things like big tanks and land raiders and things can potentially block line of sight, but that is much tougher because if any clear shot between the attacker and defender can be drawn, then line of sight is established. So oftentimes there are gaps between wheels and treads and things of models where line of sight can be traced. Blocking line of sight with models is technically possible, but usually very difficult. Now, line of sight from the attacking unit is determined individually on a per model basis. Each model that's in line of sight to the defending unit can then contribute their attacks. However, units can split their fire. So for example, if we had another eligible target over here, we could potentially be firing this tactical squad with some models into the Zoanthrope unit over here on the right, and some models into the Termagant squad ahead of them. In this case, if we're trying to draw our line of sight to the Termagant squad, we are able to trace line of sight from our las cannon tactical marine, as we determined before, our marine sergeant, as well as one of our bolter guys. We also have line of sight from this model here who's armed with a meltagun. However, the meltagun is a relatively short-ranged weapon, so we have to talk about weapon ranges. Now, range from each model in the unit is traced to an enemy model in the target unit that is visible to that model. You can't trace line of sight to one model in the unit and range to a different model in the unit. That's not how it works. In this case, all of these Marines armed with their bolt guns and their las cannon are going to be clearly within their weapon range. However, the Smeltagun over here only has a range of 12 inches, meaning that it has to target a visible enemy within that 12 inches, and unfortunately, there are no enemies within that distance. So this model is not going to get to attack this turn. Now, the Tactical Marine in the back here is behind a wall on the ruin that this unit is occupying. Despite the fact that the model is wholly on top of the ruin, it still needs true line of sight to the Termagants, and unfortunately, the wall will prevent that line of sight from being established. Each individual model is free to target whatever it wants, as long as that is a legal target within range and line of sight. So even if he had line of sight to both the Termagants and the Zoanthropes, he would be able to choose which model he attacks. Each weapon lists on its datasheet a number of attacks. This is the number of dice rolled when attacking with that weapon. Each of our bolters that's being contributed to this attack, including our sergeant as well as our bolter-armed tactical marine, are firing 2 shots apiece downrange at these Termagants. It's important to note that with some exceptions, a model firing ranged weapons attacks with every single one of the ranged weapons on their datasheet. You can see at the back of a unit's datasheet for the weapons that each model is equipped with, and their characteristics are typically listed on the front. There are a couple exceptions to this. For example, the pistol rule prevents a model, unless it's a monster or vehicle, from firing with any other weapons that do not have the pistol characteristic. This is different in melee, however, which we'll talk about in the fight phase. Now, technically, each one of these attacks is rolled separately, with the hit roll, wound roll, saving throw, and any damage rolled proceeding one at a time. However, there are allowances made in the rules to roll all your attacks together, and you'll find that 99% of the time you will be rolling all your attacks with a similar weapon at the same time. It speeds up gameplay, and that's generally how 40k is played. So when attacking in this manner, collect all of the dice contributed by weapons that have the same profile. So in this case, 2 dice for each bolt gun, so a total of 4 dice. Roll all of those hit rolls, and then wound rolls, and then saving throws before moving on to the next weapon characteristic in the unit. You'll continue that way until every single weapon in the unit has attacked, then you'll move on. So we have 4 total dice from our bolt guns here. The bolt guns have a ballistic skill, that's the BS characteristic on their profile, of 3+. This means that they're going to have to roll a 3 or higher to score a successful hit with that weapon. So in this case, we have 3 dice that have scored a 3 or higher, 1 dice that has not. So this attack has missed, and we can discard that die. That one's not going to be contributing anymore to this attack sequence. Now we're going to roll to see if our successful hits inflict damage on the target. To do this, we'll refer to the strength characteristic of the weapon, which is strength 4, as well as the toughness characteristic, that's the T, on the defender's datasheet. If the strength of the attacking weapon is higher than the toughness of the target, you're going to wound on 3. If they're the same, you're going to wound on a 4. If they are higher, you're going to wound on a 5. And if they are double the toughness of the target, you'll wound on a 2. Or if the toughness of the target is double the strength of the weapon, you're going to wound on 6s. 6s will always succeed on a wound roll, regardless of the toughness of the target and any other abilities that they have, and 1s will always fail. The same for attacking as well. 6s will always succeed, and 1s will always fail. A roll of a 6 to hit or wound is considered a critical hit or wound, and these will often trigger additional abilities. There are also some abilities that make it easier to critical depending on the target of the weapon, such as the anti-infantry or anti-vehicle weapon characteristic. So in this case, the strength 4 bolt gun has a higher strength than the toughness characteristic of the termagants here, which is toughness 3, so a successful wound roll would be a 3 or higher. In this case, all 3 attacks have scored a 3 or higher, which means they then move on to the saving throw. Now, troops in the 41st Millennium are fairly well armored. They all have a save characteristic, that's SV on their profile, that determines the effectiveness of their war gear at mitigating damage. Now, save characteristics can be modified by cover and armor penetration. Bolt guns, however, do not have an armor penetration characteristic, so we don't have to worry about that right now. However, cover will come into play. The termagants have a save characteristic of 5 on their datasheet, meaning that for each successful wound roll against them, and we have 3 wound rolls that the bolt guns have made, on a 5 or higher on a 1d6 roll, they will instead take 0 damage and their armor will block the shot. This can be improved by cover, however, and there are several ways to get cover. The most common ways are being obscured by terrain, meaning that any part of the model taking the save is behind the area of a terrain feature. Also, being wholly within most types of terrain will also provide cover. So these termagants, even if they were out in the open and fully visible, because they were wholly within the ruin here, they would be taking cover behind rocks or pieces of rubble, and that would also provide them cover. The effective cover is a +1 improvement to your save. So these termagants would go from saving on 5s to then saving on 4s. Cover has a lot of idiosyncrasies around the models from which the visibility is drawn and models that can gain cover. One thing to note is that models with a 3+ save cannot be improved to a 2+ save thanks to cover if there's no armor penetration characteristics of the attacking weapon. You can never go from a 3+ to a 2+, but if the attacker has an armor penetration characteristic that would reduce your armor save, then you can still gain cover. I will throw the rule up on the screen here so you can read it yourself, and I will point you to my terrain video, which talks about all of the complicated rules surrounding 40k's terrain system in more concrete detail. Once the wound rolls have been determined, the controlling player of the defending unit assigns saves individually to each model. Now, normally this can be fast dice roll, just like we did with attacks, especially if you have a lot of models that have the same attributes. In this case, the models that are on this side of the ruin here are going to be obscured from the attacking unit, so these models would be benefiting from cover, so the Tyrannid player would be behooved to assign saves to them first. Cover is determined on a per model basis, so each model that is benefiting from cover would have to be rolled for separately. If those models are destroyed by failing their saving throw, then the next attack would have to be applied somewhere else that may not have cover. It is important to note as well that there are some restrictions to where saves can be allocated. If you have a multi-model unit and one of your models in the unit is wounded, they must receive any subsequent saving throws, and you have to continue making saving throws on a single model for an entire phase until that model is dead or the phase ends. So in this case, we're going to roll 3 dice for the termagants in cover. We have 2 4+ and 1 dice roll below a 4, meaning that that 1 dice fails and one of these models that's in cover will have to be removed. Once that save is failed, the target receives damage equal to the damage characteristic of the attacking model's attack. In this case, a bolt gun is 1 damage, and a number of damage that a model can suffer is indicated by their wounds characteristic. As we can see, termagants are relatively fragile. They can only receive 1 wound before dying, so each failed saving throw in this case would remove a termagant. If we were looking at the return fire, however, the Space Marines have a wounds characteristic of 2, meaning that a failed saving throw against an attack will not in fact kill the model in question. They would suffer 1 damage and continue to fight. However, because they are now wounded, further attacks must then be allocated to that model. Now we fired our bolt weapons, let's go ahead and fire with the las cannon. So we've completed the attack sequence for our strength 4 AP0 weapons, now we're firing our big laser beam. This weapon only contributes 1 attack to its attack pool, so we're only shooting 1 time with it, and it hits on a 4+. We can see that its strength is clearly more than double the toughness characteristic of those termagants, so it's going to be wounding on a 2+. So as long as we don't roll a 1 on this roll, we've gotten a successful 6, that wound is going to penetrate. Now, the las cannon has an armor penetration characteristic, that's the AP on their ranged weapon profile, of 3. This means that the saving throw of the defending unit is going to be modified by -3. Now, for a unit with as low a save characteristic as these termagants, this means that they're actually going to be unable to save, since even rolling a 6 on one of these saving characteristics would modify it back to a 3. In that case, even the models benefiting from cover that only successfully save on a 4 are still going to fail the saving throw and have that damage be applied to them. Now, the las cannon is a multi-damage weapon. It's shooting d6 plus 1 damage, so after the saving throw is failed, the attacker is going to roll a d6 and add 1 for a total of 2 for the damage suffered by the defender. Now, models each take damage individually. The damage isn't applied across the unit. So even though this weapon is doing 2 damage to the termagant unit, only 1 termagant is going to be removed, since the excess damage will simply overkill that 1 model. However, if we were firing at a large tank that had multiple wounds, or a multi-wound unit like these tactical marines, you can see that multi-damage weapons would be much more valuable. Now, the save characteristic of a model on its data sheet is referred to as the armor saving throw, but there are other saving throws available in 40k. In contrast to the diminutive termagants, the powerful Hive Tyrant here has what's called an invulnerable save. This is an unmodifiable save characteristic. So if this Hive Tyrant was wounded by an attack with a high enough armor penetration to defeat its 2+ armor save, it could fall back on its slightly worse but also unmodifiable invulnerable save to save on a 4+, regardless of the armor penetration characteristic of the attacking unit. Once every eligible unit from the active player's army has been selected to shoot and performed their shooting activations, we move on to the charge phase. This is when units get up close and personal with their opponents and try to move into melee combat. Now, units that did not advance or fall back are eligible to attempt charges. So for this example, let's say that these tactical marines are going to attempt to charge the termagants, as well as the Space Marine captain over here. Now, during the charge phase, each unit has a charge phase activation, just like in the movement and shooting phases. During their activation in the charge phase, a unit can attempt to charge 1 or more enemy units that are within 12 inches. You don't require line of sight for the charge to be made. You can charge things that are hiding away from you. However, you do have to be able to move into engagement range of them, so that is 1 inch. Once you have selected your targets for a charge, you then roll a charge roll. This is a 2d6 roll and determines how far your unit will go with that charge. In this case, we've actually rolled perfectly. We rolled a 5, which means the tactical squad can move 5 inches to attempt to get within engagement range of the termagants. If we had rolled less than 5, a 4 for example, we would be too far away to successfully complete a charge within 1 inch, meaning that the charge would fail and the activated unit simply stands there and does nothing. If you don't roll enough to get within 1 inch of your target, you don't do anything. Once a charge has been established, you make a charge move. This is a move up to this distance towards the target unit. So in this case, we can move the tactical squad up here, and we can engage them in combat if you want to. It is a little idiosyncrasy of the charge phase, however, that in some circumstances, you're not actually required to engage the target. You're simply required to move towards them. Now we're going to do the same thing for the Space Marine captain over here, who has a much easier charge. In this case, he's rolled a huge number. He's rolled an 11, meaning he's going to move 11 inches towards the termagants. Now, if you have a high roll, unlike what we got with the tactical marines over here, a roll that would give you enough charge movement to move into base-to-base contact with at least 1 model in the target unit, you are required to do so. So while the tactical marines didn't have to move to base-to-base contact with the termagants because they didn't roll high enough on their charge to be able to do that, the Space Marine captain absolutely does. So he is going to move up. Now, charges are completed 1 at a time, and no other movement or attacks are made during the charge phase. Once all of the charges are complete, you then move on to the fight phase. Now, the fight phase is unique amongst all of the phases in that it allows both players to have activations, not simply the player whose turn it is. Melee can be very lethal in Warhammer 40,000 because both armies get the opportunity to attack. Now, the order in which units fight in the fight phase is determined by an ability called Fights First. Many units will have Fights First on their datasheet, applied as part of an ability or contributed by a leader, and units with the Fight First ability are required to be selected to activate before other units in each player's army. Now, charging, if you've made a successful charge, like both of these Space Marine units did, grants the Fights First ability. So charging units will generally fight before defending units. In both the Fights First step of the fights phase and the fight normal non-fight first step of the fight phase, when the units that don't have fight first get to attack, the defender, the player whose turn it is not, will choose the first unit to activate. So if, for example, these Termagants had the fight first ability, they would be eligible to fight before the Space Marines that charged them. In this case, however, the Termagants don't have fights first, so instead, all of the Space Marines are going to get to make their attacks before the Termagants are allowed to swing. So let's say we start with this Tactical Marine squad here. These guys are going to be selected by the Ultramarines player to fight first. When a unit is selected to fight, the first thing it does is what's called a pile-in move. This is a movement of up to 3 inches towards the nearest enemy model, and this is determined on a per model basis, not the nearest model to the unit. It's the nearest model to each model in your unit. However, this move can move them within engagement range, and if they're able to, it must move into base-to-base contact with an enemy. However, what can be done with this move is potentially engaging new enemy units. So for example, the Tactical Marine in the back of this squad is going to be closer to this Hive Tyrant, were it to be positioned here. So after this Tactical Marine is selected to fight, all of the models move towards the closest enemy model, which means that this Tactical Marine would move towards the Hive Tyrant. Now, in order for this move to be legal, it must both be in coherency as normal and also must end engaging an enemy unit. So if there are no enemies to engage, you're not allowed to make a pile-in move. If possible, they must be moved base-to-base contact with an enemy as well, just like the charge move. Once that pile-in move is complete, we select targets for each of the attacking members of the attacking unit. Now, in order for a unit to be able to attack, it must either be base-to-base with an enemy model. So in this case, these 3 Space Marines in front here are going to be in contact with the Termagant, so they are going to get to fight. Or it must be in contact with a friendly who is itself in contact with an enemy. So the las cannon armed heavy weapon Marine in the back here can also fight into the Termagants because the Tactical Marine is sort of chaining him through. You can also attack if you're within engagement range of an enemy, but not necessarily in base-to-base contact. So if the Heavy Weapon Marine was here, for example, he could fight. However, the Tactical Marine in the back here is not in engagement range of the Termagants, not base-to-base with the Tactical Marines in the front, so he is ineligible to make his attacks. Now, if you have multiple units that you are engaging, you can select which enemy unit to target with your attacks, and this works almost exactly like targeting with ranged weapons. However, line of sight is not required, and cover is not conferred. If you do have multiple potential targets, you can split your attacks between them as you see fit. However, unlike shooting, models in melee will only ever attack with a single weapon, so they would choose one of their weapons to attack with, unless they have weapons with the extra attacks ability, which they can attack with in addition to another weapon. So in this case, each of these 4 Space Marines that is base-to-base with a Termagant, within engagement range of a Termagant, or chaining through another friendly model that's base-to-base with a Termagant, is going to contribute its attack. We then take a look at their melee weapon profile and choose a melee weapon for them to use. Each of these standard Marines here is equipped with just a regular close combat weapon, which is a pretty standard profile for non-melee specialists. However, the Sergeant does have a special weapon. He has a Power Fist, so we're going to give him a different color of dice just to differentiate those. We're now going to roll attacks, and these function exactly like ranged attack. So we're going to roll against the weapon skill this time of the weapon. In this case, the Space Marines hit on a 3+, so we're going to get rid of that failure. We're going to calculate their strength versus the target's toughness. They have a strength of 4 with their close combat weapon. The Termagants are only toughness 3, so they are then wounding on a 3. Looks like we have 2 additional failures that we're going to remove. The Termagants can then roll a saving throw against their save characteristic of 5. So we're going to see what they get. It looks like they will make 2 saves, a pretty good roll for the Termagants, and 1 Termagant is going to be removed. Because the sergeant has a power fist, which is a more powerful melee weapon, he's going to be rolling his attacks separately because his characteristics are different. He hits on a 3+ with his fist, looks like we've gained 2 hits, and then he compares his strength of 8 to the target's toughness of 3, which is easily double their toughness, so he is going to be wounding that on 2s. Looks like 2 wounds go through. Its AP value, because there is no cover applied, is enough to entirely negate the save characteristic of the termagants, so 2 more termagants are going to be removed. Remember that while the Power Fist is a multi-damage weapon, the excess damage does not spill over to additional termagants in the unit. Each of those termagants is going to suffer both of the damage from the Power Fist itself and then be killed. Once the unit has completed resolving its attacks, it can then make what is called a consolidation move. This is almost identical to a pile-in move with one important caveat. So it must move 3 inches with each model moving towards the closest enemy model, and if they can move base to base with those models, then they must. However, if for whatever reason they had killed their charge target and there were no other enemy units within 4 inches for them to move 3 inches to and engage, just like the pile-in move, you wouldn't normally be able to perform the consolidation move, but if that move instead could move you onto an objective marker within 3 inches of it, then you can move that way. So just by way of example, let's say that there's an objective marker behind the Tactical Marine squad, the termagants have been wiped out by their charge, and there are no other enemies within 4 inches. You can then make your consolidation move with the Tactical Marines back towards this objective marker in order to land on top of it. However, if there is another model that is within 4 inches of where that unit began that consolidation move, that model basically magnetizes the unit to it. So that unit must then instead go towards, in this case, the Hive Tyrant instead of the objective marker. It's important to note that all of these pile-in and consolidation moves, if you're not forced to go base to base, just require you to move towards that model, not directly towards it. So you can game it a little bit. For example, this model moving starts 4 inches away, just has to end the move closer than 4 inches, so he could actually move onto the objective marker as long as he ends closer to the Hive Tyrant. The only restriction to that is that if your model can base the target, it must. So if he was significantly closer and could move base to base, he would have less control over what he could do with the consolidation move. Now, assuming that the charge didn't kill the termagants, the Space Marine Captain would then be able to activate. As long as you successfully completed a charge, you are eligible to activate in the fight phase. So even though he's not engaging any enemy unit, he can go through the same sequence that the Tactical Squad just did. He can pile in, make his attacks, probably killing several termagants, and then consolidate in order to engage new enemy units. Once all of the units that struck first have completed their activations, and in this case both the Tactical Squad and the Captain struck first because they had completed charges this turn, any units that are currently engaged in melee can then activate. So in this case, the termagants would then be chosen by the defending player to attack. They would roll their attack sequence out, and we would move to any other units that are engaged in melee, but that did not strike first. This can occur if you have been charged or are stuck in an ongoing combat after the attacker has charged, but neither of you have been wiped out. Now, it's important to note that if your unit did not charge, the only things that make it eligible to attack is currently being engaged with enemies. There are some situations, for example, where a unit would suffer casualties, remove the casualties that are engaging the attacking units, and then be outside of engagement range. In that case, if the attackers do not consolidate into combat with you, this unit would, despite being charged, no longer be eligible to attack because it's no longer engaging any enemies and did not itself charge that turn. Now, once the fight phase has completed and everyone has made their attacks, we would move on to the other player's turn. But there is one further step at the end of each turn, and that is redressing coherency. So coherency must be established by multi-model units every time they move or are set up on the battlefield. However, because the defender always assigns damage from incoming attacks, it is possible for them to have their units be out of coherency because models in the center of the coherency chain were killed. If this is the case, then at the end of each turn, after the fight phase has concluded, each player will go through their units that are out of coherency and remove models as casualties until the unit returns into coherency. I have a whole video about exactly how this occurs and some of the weird stuff you can do with it, But generally speaking, if you have a situation like this where these termagants were in coherency at the start of the turn, they had models that were within 2 inches of 2 other models in the unit at the center of the chain, but were removed to casualties, the controlling player would then likely just remove 1/2 or another of these models that are now out of coherency, so that coherency is then reestablished on these models. One thing that's important to note for situations like this to arise is that when assigning saving throws from ranged or melee attacks, there is no requirement that you assign them to models that are in engagement range of your opponent or in line of sight. And it's possible for attacking units to kill models in the defending unit that are not even within their line of sight. Once the attacking unit has selected the targets for all of their weapons, all of those attacks are resolved on the target unit until either the target unit is destroyed or the attacker has completed all of their attacks, even if the damage would pull the unit out of line of sight or range. Once an attack is targeted at an enemy, it's basically locked in and it's going to resolve no matter what. However, what can happen is a situation like this where these termagants maybe were in the center of the unit but were in line of sight. The defender elected to assign saves to them so that the rest of the unit was then out of line of sight thanks to the ruin in front of them, so future enemy units couldn't attack them. Each unit that targeted them would be able to resolve all its attacks, but then when you moved on to the next shooting activation, you would check line of sight again, and if that unit was not in line of sight, then they would not be an eligible target. That would, however, force this coherency check at the end of the turn and potentially lose more of the termagants anyway. Once the coherency check is complete, the turn is concluded. It then moves on to the opponent's turn, and they go through the exact same order of operations. That continues 5 times until 5 battle rounds have been completed, and each player gets to act through 5 turns. Then the game ends, and the player with the most victory points, which we'll discuss in the future, wins the game. We'll talk about missions, scoring victory points, and exactly how victory is achieved in future videos. In the next video, we'll talk about some more advanced rules, including things like battle shock, stratagems, and reinforcements. Let me know down in the comment section if you found this video useful for your games of Warhammer 40,000. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon, patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.